Hey, good afternoon. On today's Lunch and Learn, we're going to be demonstrating and showcasing the value of Microsoft Relationship Sales. My name is Nick Fratello. I'm a business applications specialist here in Burlington, Massachusetts. And on the Teams call, we've got Brian Galicia. Brian, feel free to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, everybody. Brian Galicia. I am actually in Redmond, Washington, so on the other side of the coast of the United States from Nick. And thank you, Nick, for having me. So I'm part of our global Dynamics organization, and I'm accountable for all the things we do with LinkedIn Sales Navigator and Dynamics 365. So as Nick and I have conversations, we might be referring to Microsoft Relationship Sales or the acronym MRSS. Just know it's our value offering of how do we blend Sales Navigator, LinkedIn Sales Navigator, and Dynamics 365 to offer value to organizations to transform how they can turn relationships into revenue.
Yeah, it's critical, right? So when we talk about enabling sellers with signals, that's a lot of the value around the Microsoft's relationship database, right? Of who knows whom and how we can take advantage of that and empower sellers as well as empower around training and HR. So give me a little bit more insight of the capabilities and scenarios that Microsoft Relationship Sales empowers from a sales perspective.
Yeah, it's a great tee-up question, Nick. So I think that where I like to start with educating people who are listening to this Lunch and Learn is when Microsoft acquired LinkedIn about a year and a half ago, there were a lot of questions of, wow, that was a pretty significant acquisition of $26 billion. How does that add value to me as a potential customer? Or if you are a customer of Microsoft, how do you take advantage of that? I think that the way to start is thinking about, if you're listening to this video, you most likely, it's probably a safe bet that you yourself have a LinkedIn profile. Depending on how many connections you have or how many years of experience you have, it may be pretty robust, or maybe you're just getting started. When you think about LinkedIn, there's all this wealth of information about not only just who you are as a person in your profile, because when you create a LinkedIn profile, you're sharing information about either A, what you care about, or you're looking for a job. And as you build your career, the one thing that is a kind of a commonality is that we all start to build our network in a professional connections to where when we meet someone, when we engage with them, or in this case with Nick, like I've known Nick for a long time, as long as I've been in the Dynamics business, you start to build relationships digitally that then turn offline. And so LinkedIn, this current statistic is there's over 610 million members, what they call members, that have profiles on the platform. And so if you think about 610 million people globally, what if we can enable organizations to take advantage in a private, secure manner, take advantage of certain information and insights that LinkedIn provides? And so I'll use one example for selling, and then I'll talk about some other things of where LinkedIn comes into play. But you think about what you described, Nick, on selling scenarios. The whole thing is that when you're trying to drive a valuable conversation with your customer, especially for people who are in a selling role, listening to this podcast or to this Lunch and Learn, the critical thing is understanding when I look for Nick Fratello and doing a search for the name, the first thing that most sellers do is, do I know them? Or does someone in my network know them? And of course, LinkedIn does a great job of that. But the thing that gets unlocked when organizations make a bigger investment with a solution, kind of the best version of LinkedIn for sellers, is when they unlock that through Sales Navigator, which is LinkedIn, but unlocking more data that gives sellers information to understand who to have a conversation with, kind of spotlights of buying criteria. So if I was to look for Nick, and let's say I didn't know Nick, and no one in my network knew Nick, but I worked at a company that was fairly large, like Microsoft, where someone in my organization may know him, that's where some of the power starts to come in, because you're unlocking the value of that information to then give that value back to a seller. Another scenario is, what if I can follow that person and start to understand, once I start to see what they're doing, what they're posting, what their interested are. You can kind of do that in free LinkedIn, but it's not as easy to do in Sales Navigator. Again, getting a point of view to start driving the right conversations with the right people, because you're following what they're doing. And if you're a very good seller, You're trying to ascertain how you can add value before just doing your show up and start saying, I want to sell to you, which of course is the thing that we all used to do. And when I think about when I started my sales career, that's what I used to do. It doesn't work as well versus really trying to have a point of view saying, here's my story of how I can help you. And how you can do that is through, again, a letter of understanding to drive that challenger methodology or challenger sale to understand and give value at the time it's needed because you have access to information. And then when you tie that with Microsoft, it's great because then you start to tie in all the things that sellers start to use, which is common tools that sellers use all the time is productivity with Office, business applications with CRM and Dynamics, or social with LinkedIn. And so because Microsoft owns all those assets, we believe that we can empower the modern seller to have these conversations because using the right tool at the right time is giving the seller access to information at the time they need it so they can take action. So when you think about that more broadly, when LinkedIn is tied to other things within Microsoft, other good examples where it adds value is, let's just assume that Nick sends me an email and I opened up that out in Outlook. I can very easily, in context to that experience, click on his Outlook contact card and see his free LinkedIn profile appear. So it gives me some context to understand, how do I know Nick and what's his background? Another good example is, let's say you were looking for a job and trying to leverage other people's profiles or what they share on LinkedIn to help adjust what you're trying to put together for your point of view because you're in similar roles. So being able to import LinkedIn information so that when someone is creating a resume in Word, it takes that information in. And there's so many other scenarios that we're thinking about within Microsoft that takes advantage of that. But the bottom line is LinkedIn is such a critical piece to our modern selling or relationship selling approach because it gives the seller the ability to, again, turn those relationships into revenue because they can immediately unlock and understand the connection points, the warm introductions, the buying committee of understanding if I'm talking to Nick, who are other people that may be in Nick's inner circle that I should be having conversations with. So there are so many, again, rich engagements, Nick, that I know that was a long-winded answer, but there's so many things that organizations can do when they take the power of relationship selling and blend LinkedIn Sales Navigator and a business application like Dynamics.
Yeah, it's a great point. When you look at the 610 million profiles and taking those relationships and how does it impact the business processes, right? So I think at the core, LinkedIn was founded around the ability to create your personal profile and search for jobs and recruiters could find you. But now the ability to weave those relationships into recruiting and onboarding and the ability to do training with LinkedIn's learning platforms. There's so much value that comes from that relationships, and empowering sellers was probably at the core and the ethos, but now Microsoft has really amplified that in other avenues. So starting by empowering sales, but next there's the empowerment of HR. There's the empowerment of the individual employee to be able to understand, here's what some of the training and content that might be relevant to their job profile. But you also talked about the challenger sale, right? Part of the challenger sale is having something to contribute to the conversation when you're engaging your customers. So demonstrating knowledge of specific topics, regardless of industry, is critical when reaching out and trying to broker new relationships to open up business development opportunities, whether it's recruiting or if it's sales or if it's really introducing your organization to another organization. How do you quickly convey that? And being that challenger sale with content and that relationship is really a kind of a marriage made in heaven. So it's really a differentiator for Microsoft's business applications to be able to take advantage of those 610 million profiles and the signals of intelligence of who knows who and how to empower that across multiple different channels within an organization. It's really pretty empowering if you think about it.
Yeah, exactly, Nick. I mean, I couldn't have said it any better. I think to your point, the systems intelligence or that that information that sellers can get reaction to based on what's happening. Another good example, exactly to that point, is the fact that as sellers, when we leave meetings, the common engagement is the customer asks us, hey, can you send me XYZ? And you and I have been in many different customer conversations where that occurs. And usually the response or the action that sellers take is that they respond. And then, of course, the action is I put a whole bunch of attachments in that email. One of the things that when you marry LinkedIn with Microsoft, the ability for us to do that is, of course, we're not replacing that process, but what we are doing is enhancing it to where, what if when a seller sends content back to a person or a contact that potentially could be a customer, that they can get that intelligence back to understand what did they look at, what did they engage with. If they forwarded that email around and those other people engage with that content, understand the broader buying community to understand who else is looking at this and can I see their information and profile. All those things are great capabilities that LinkedIn provides, that then when you marry that within a business application like Dynamics, taking that signal in to say, if I sent you that information, Nick, to have you consume, the moment you looked at it, what of that signal can immediately go into the timeline of the record of what you're tracking in a business application like Dynamics to do that. And those are all things that drive this broader conversation, because our point of view at Microsoft, and you said it succinctly, it's not just about the selling point of view. We're trying to do many different things to provide an end-to-end business process, but being able to do it to take all the common tools that sellers use every day, because it can't just be CRM, it can't just be Office, and it can't just be LinkedIn all independently working together. They all have to work in conjunction with each other, because sellers are going to utilize the tool that they need at the time they need to use it. And the biggest thing that I've observed when you think about rollouts of new solutions, not only training is important in change management, but it does require the ability to have these things all interoperating with each other, so that when I'm in that experience, the in context details that are coming from other things are just inherently happening, so that seller can be more productive in the tool that they're at and using at the time they're using it.
Yeah, I agree. One thing that you reminded me of is just the tools within Sales Navigator, like Point Drive. So Point Drive is the ability for sellers and to be able to create and share content, but to empower those signals. So you and I have been involved in many meetings where, like you said, you're following up and you're sending materials to somebody as a follow-up. Point Drive is LinkedIn and Sales Navigator's content repository, and it gives you the ability to create a micro website for sharing pieces of information, whether it's a file or a video or a Word document or an Office document, but then to receive those notifications automatically and to be able to look at the telemetry of what's being consumed. And it's not just Brian has visited this Point Drive site, but it's Brian has visited this site and as well as has opened up the file 5 times in the last 25 minutes and maybe spent a specific amount of time looking at one of those files. So from a seller perspective, the empowerment really comes around the telemetry of what's being consumed, how it's being consumed, by who, and how often, right? So as a seller, we want to be able to empower with those signals, and Point Drive is a phenomenal tool that if you haven't discovered yet, take a look at Point Drive, as it's a indispensable tool, I think, for Brian and myself, and I think Brian would definitely agree.
Yeah, exactly.
So Brian, any other tips for empowering sellers with Microsoft Relationship Sales and LinkedIn and Sales Navigator with Dynamics 365? If they wanted to learn more, where would they go and dive in?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that if you are a current Microsoft customer today, is reach out to your local Microsoft team to ask a point of view, to say, hey, I'd like to learn more about what I learned on this Lunch and Learn to dive deeper. If not, then it's just there is a great content on our website that if you just do a search for Microsoft Relationship Sales, it will take you to a whole bunch of information and great content that is available. Another way is if you connect with Nick or I on LinkedIn, another great way to interact. And I think the biggest takeaway they always have is that all the things we're talking about that I've been talking about with Nick, it really starts with a point of view as a tool is a tool. And the one thing I always want to make sure that people who understand our point of view is that you have to make sure you have the right sellers, meaning that you're hiring still for the right seller profile for whatever service or product you sell. Because providing a tool to a non-seller isn't going to make that person necessarily a better seller. But if you have the right sellers and the right profile and you arm them with the right education, change management, and training, it elevates that conversation even more so, because now you're unlocking the power of that great seller with additional information that's going to help them propel themselves with continuing to be successful in driving sales conversations. Again, by transforming your organization to be modern sellers, to take digital conversations offline, but also to maximize the opportunity to turn relationships into revenue. So thanks, Nick. I appreciate you having me on this Lunch and Learn, and I know we're going to do a few more of these. So look forward to the next conversation we have. Thanks again.
Thank you, Brian. And we'll put all of the links in the show notes, and stay tuned for additional Lunch and Learn. If you have any additional questions, please leave them in the comments, and we'll do our best to follow up. But thank you again, Brian. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.